August of 2021, we did better than August of 2019 pre-COVID. And so it just shows you that freedom works. And look, people vote with their feet. If the media was right and that these other states, the New Yorks and that, were the right way and Florida did the wrong way, then you would see people leaving Florida to flock to those states. And in fact, you see the opposite.
Back in 2018, after a hotly contested election, Ron DeSantis was elected governor of Florida. It was a tight race, but since then, the governor has dramatically shifted the political tide in the state of Florida. Florida now has a majority of Republican voters for the first time in state history. Before this, Ron DeSantis served as a congressman here in Florida from 2013 to 2018. But it was in 2020 his name really broke through. His leadership through COVID-19 drew the eyes of many as he was unwilling to accept that society had to crumble and people's livelihoods stripped in order to take on the virus.
And while so many governors over the last year had kept locking people down, Florida lifted people up.
Since then, Governor DeSantis has only grown in popularity, suing the Biden administration over the COVID-19 vaccine mandate, taking action against the immigration crisis on the southern border, and even acting to solve the ongoing national supply chain interruptions. Governor DeSantis is often reading the tea leaves of national politics while defending rights within Florida. His action is part of a new sense of state power that's gone unappreciated for a very long time. In this episode, the governor and I discuss the biggest lies the media has manufactured about Florida and about him over these past 2 years, just how his trademark fighting attitude came about, and the surprising upside to all of the smearing from the mainstream media. Hey, and welcome. This is the Ben Shapiro Show Sunday Special. Today's show is sponsored by ExpressVPN.com/Ben. Governor DeSantis, thanks so much for giving us your office and allowing us to...
Welcome to the Florida Capitol.
I got to tell you, this is a great state, and thank you for making this state so great, really, truly. It's an amazing state to be in. So why don't we start from the beginning for people who really don't know your background prior to you leaping onto the national scene as governor of the state. They don't live in the state of Florida, for example. So how did you get started in politics in the first place?
Well, sometimes people ask me that. I say it was a momentary lapse in judgment because my first foray into politics was actually running for Congress in 2012. And it was a redistricting year. There was 2 additional seats. I happened to be living in one of those areas. I had some people tell me that I should run. I started off 7-way primary. I had no name ID and no money when I started, and ended up winning by almost 20 points in a 6-month campaign. So I was in the Congress for 3 terms, and then I got elected as governor in 2018 here in the great state of Florida.
And what was sort of your driving motivation to get involved in elected politics? Because it's not an easy job, and from where I sit, it doesn't look like that fun a job, to be honest with you. So what got you started thinking about doing that?
Well, in 2012, that was kind of in the Obama era, and I really saw Obama as taking the country in a direction that was not consistent with kind of the core founding principles of the country. In fact, I even wrote a book prior to me going into office about it. Was read by about a dozen people at the time, but nevertheless, it's out there where I kind of talked about how kind of the founders conceived this, how people like Lincoln and Reagan applied these principles, and how we were really veering off that. And those were good fights, and I'm glad we did it. But I got to tell you, I look back at that now, it's almost kind of quaint, because I think what we're facing now has been much more aggressive from the left in terms of across a wide range of institutions, not just the federal government, which of course they are being very aggressive, but big tech, corporate media, academia, all these things, the bureaucracy, all these things that are happening. So I got into it because I saw some things going wrong. And here in Florida, I think the good thing about it is you actually can do something about it. You know, in the Congress, you're one of 435. So much of the power is all within the leadership. So a lot of these big bills, there'll be thousands of page bills. They'll do it behind closed doors, and they'll shove it down the throats of everyone. You don't have time to read it. And that's kind of how it's going. So if you're somebody that has good ideas and have a lot of energy, you kind of get ground down in Washington. And so we were able to do some things, but I looked at the governor and I was like, you know what? If you are willing to lead and you're willing to get out in front on issues, you have an opportunity to do a lot of good things. And so that's what we've been able to do. And I think that I probably did more as governor in my first 2 weeks in terms of tangible, long-lasting accomplishments than a normal congressman can do in a decade.
It really is incredible. And it is a reminder, I think, to a lot of Americans that the states really do matter. So if you're like me and you lived your entire life in California, the way you tend to think of yourself just in terms of state identity is you're sort of culturally Californian, but there's no such thing as sort of an independent Californian political identity vis-a-vis the federal government. Whatever the federal government does in terms of growing and expanding, well, that's what California is doing to you anyway. It's actually the federal government's usually trailing California. Then once my family and I moved here, you see that there's an actual state identity, and that state identity really rests in protecting liberties that the federal government may be encroaching upon and in upholding certain standards that the state of Florida actually sees differently than a lot of the rest of the country.
Yeah, and I think when I became governor, this was prior to COVID, of course, 2019, I had 3 appointments to the Florida Supreme Court. So we had a very liberal Supreme Court. I replaced 3 liberal justices with 3 conservative justices. So we now have the most conservative Supreme Court in the country, arguably, in the state of Florida. That makes a huge difference because what we do legislatively, what I sign into law, it's not going to be struck down based on state judicial activism. As we started to get into COVID, and I think people appreciated when we did that in Florida and when we did some other things, but then when we got into COVID, you started to see radically different approaches to how do the people that you elect value your freedoms and your own decision-making and your own liberty. And you had states across the country that just kept locking people down, mandate, restriction. And in Florida, we made the decision, we want to lift people up. We want to empower them with the tools they need to make their own decisions, to be healthy, to do all that. But we got to have schools open. People have a right to work. You got to have businesses have a right to operate. And so we did that. And then I think you started to see a lot of unrest in the country, the rioting, lawlessness, people attacking police, defunding police, rogue prosecutors. And I think people are looking like, man, this is not the type of community I want to live in. So you've seen a radical difference between a state like Florida, where we're valuing people's freedoms, we're supporting safe communities, supporting law enforcement, doing all that, and then some of these other more leftist jurisdictions where they kept locking down, kept violating people's rights, and then seems like the only rights they respect are the rights of these criminals that are able to get away with a lot. So I think the distinction between a liberal, quote, state and a state like Florida has probably never been so stark because of all the issues we've dealt with over the last 2 years.
For sure. I mean, it bust wide open during COVID, but I think...
Because the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that away.